So something that also helps us to think about what blood kinship means and how it could be understood differently from different society is also that in several places, the two parents don't have the same roles in reproduction. So males and females, when they have children, they are not thought of both contributing to reproduction. And you can also have widely different examples of this variation. So in Turkey, for example, Delany describes how it is the male that does almost everything when it comes to procreating. So the male gives life and the women simply give birth. Women in Turkish villages, says Delany, are only supposed to give birth, and they are thought of as only nurturing the life that comes from the male. So they don't have a 50-50 role in reproduction like we might think they have. Something that is at the opposite side of the spectrum is for Trobriand Islanders. So Trobriand Islanders, on the opposite, give very little role to the father. So they consider very little the father in reproduction. Trobriand Islanders are matrilinear, so the children belong to the lineage of their mother and not of their father. Their father has emotional, affective ties with their children, and they are very important in their lives. But from the point of view of kinship groups and of the lineage, the father actually is not of the same lineage as his children. Instead, the mother's brothers are the ones who are part of the lineage, and so have a bit the duty of a role to make sure that the children behave properly, that they are good members of the lineage, and that their sisters can have offspring that continue the matrilineage. So when it comes to procreation and having children, the Trobrianders believe that when a person dies, they journey to an island and the soul becomes young again, and then it becomes a spirit child or Baloma. This spirit child will then reincarnate as a fetus, as a child, in the womb of a woman of the same lineage. So in this way, the matrilineage of a Trobriander continues in eternity as its members, when they die, then incarnate again in the matrilineage. So what is interesting for us here is that conception is a matter of a woman becoming pregnant by a child, a spirit child, the Baloma, of the same lineage, entering the body of a woman. And this child enters the body of a woman either through the head or by being in a pail of water that the woman drinks. And sometimes when Trobriand mothers want to conceive a child, want to become pregnant, their brother would help them by bringing a pail of water to them on their door. And in all of this, the role of the father of reproduction is minimized, is considered almost unimportant at all. And this is not to say that this actual biological father is not important, or this is not to say that sex has a role here. For example, Trobriander think that sex will help this baby grow in the womb, but also prepare the woman to give birth. But in procreation, the most important people are the brother, who is helping out this lineage to continue, the Baloma, which is the spirit child who gets incarnated in the woman, and the woman who makes the child. So very differently than in Turkey, the woman is the most important in procreation, and the male is not so important at all, which is exactly the opposite than in Turkey. All of this helps us see that when we think of a conception and when we think of the biological roots, like the biological basis of kinship, for us, again, in North American society, in Western Europe and in Italy, blood and the biological basis are essential to thinking about kinship, but not in all society it is like that. And one more example is the Wari, which live in the Amazon. And Aparecida Vilaca did very interesting studies on the concept of the body for the Wari. And the Wari think that a child's body in the womb is formed with the help of all men who have sexual relations with the mother. So if a woman is pregnant and she has sexual relations, all of these men who she has sexual relations with will help to form the body of a child. Only one of them will assume parenthood in the end, but they all take part of it, so to speak. And this goes with the idea that bodies are continuously fabricated. After birth, body continues to be made in an exchange with the surrounding, through food and through coming in contact with other people, and also through exchange of bodily substances, sweat, as well as sexual fluid, while they live together with other people. So people who are partners, for example, become consubstantial, made of the same substance. They are said to have the same body. Because living together in one place is also very important, then people who live together are thought to become kin. By living together, by eating together, by basically consuming the same substances, they again become consubstantial kin. In contrast, people who we might say are related by blood are actually genealogically related, but perhaps live somewhere else, and with whom they do not have contacts, then the Wari drop them out of the kinship list because they do not have contacts with them. So over time, in a sense, they cease to become kin, and the people they live with are the people that they become kin in practice by living together. So I find this very interesting, and you can try this thought experiment by yourself for your own life. Think, who would become your kin if you think of residency, being together, eating together? If this was the case, who would become your kin? Who, on the other hand, are people who you would cease to be related to simply because you haven't seen them in a long time, or perhaps you haven't seen them for years, or you don't really exchange food or exchange living in proximity with one another. Like, think about that. How would your idea of family and who you're related with change? And of course, we could also think of a current pandemic. How would that change in a pandemic, or perhaps some people who you were close to before, you cannot see any longer? So would they become kin if living together and commensality and being consubstantial is the basis of kinship? I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about a chapter called Paper and Being, written by Sienna Craig in her book, The End of Kinship, that she published in 2020. Sienna Craig is an anthropologist who has done many years of ethnographic fieldwork or participant observation in Nepal, and specifically in the region of Mustang that borders with Tibet. Because she's interested in migration, she also worked with people from Mustang who live in New York and in other places in the US. And this chapter that I recommended you to read for today is actually a fictionalized ethnographic article or chapter. So what does that mean? It means that Craig created her characters and the events she talks about, so they are in this way fictions, but she did so based on many actual people and events that she encountered in her research. So the characters and the events that she writes about are credible because they could be true, and indeed they share important characteristics and life circumstances with the people that she met during her research. In this way, this chapter, while being fictional, holds ethnographic and anthropological insights because it uses fiction in order to discuss important and actual aspects of family relations and of stories of migration that are important in Mustang and among Nepalis living in the US. So in this book, more specifically, she has chapters that are completely ethnographic, so not fictionalized at all, and chapters that are fictionalized. So let's go back to this chapter called Paper and Ink. The story starts in 1875, when two brothers, Tashi and Timba, make an agreement regarding the inheritance of the land where they live. Tashi is the elder brother, and Timba is a younger brother. And you can see them here in this drawing. Because Tashi, the older brother, is not married and does not have children, the two brothers decide that when Tashi dies, and eventually both brothers pass away, the home, the field, and the grazing lands will be inherited by Timba's oldest son. This is exactly what happens 15 years later. When Tashi dies, Gawang, the oldest son of his brother, inherits the land and the house. Again, you can see him in this drawing. Gawang and his wife Dechen then continue to live in the family house, and they raise 3 children. And the contract that was drafted between the brothers and that was written on paper is then kept in the house. And here you see a drawing of all these relationships. It is at this point that things start to get a bit more complicated. It turns out that Tashi, the eldest brother, was not really childless. He had been in an official relationship with a woman, and he had a daughter called Yeshi. The mother of Yeshi, however, realizing that the father, Tashi, would not recognize this child or help care for it, sent Yeshi to live with a brother and his life in another village. And it is in this household that Yeshi grew up with a maternal uncle and aunt. Here you see that our drawing now looks like this. You can see that Tashi has actually a daughter, an illegitimate daughter called Yeshi, but she went to go live with her uncle, the brother of her mother, in another village. Eventually, Yeshi married and had 2 children, a daughter and a son. Our story takes, unfortunately, a tragic turn after a few years of her marriage, because Yeshi lost both her husband and her son. With her daughter married off and now part of a different family, Yeshi found herself all alone. She is now a widow with nobody to support her. This also meant that Yeshi could not keep the land or the house where she lived. These rights, Craig, were claimed by the younger brother of her husband and his family. So Yeshi found herself literally with nothing. And here the story of Craig helps us think a little bit how particular family forms and kinship systems may contribute to the very vulnerable position of some of its members. In this case, in the story, the vulnerable position of a woman who grew up as an illegitimate daughter and then found herself a widow. Because she had nowhere to go, Yeshi then returned to the village where she was born and where her father Tashi had lived. She moved in with Gawang, Dechen, and her 3 kids. She was, after all, the aunt of his children, and for a while they all lived peacefully in one household. Craig writes that the peace was eventually broken because over time, Yeshi realized that her own grandson, the son of the son who had died, would have no access to land or resources if this situation continued in the same way. Because of this, Yeshi decided to dispute the original agreement between the 2 brothers and was able to claim a portion of the land owned by Gawang and Dechen. So in 1924, a new arrangement was made, the land divided, and Yeshi claimed part of it. The story then continues in 1985, and it is especially interesting for us because it shows how several generations after, land, kinship, and migration actually become entangled in very complicated ways. So the second part of the story is about Yeshi's great-great-grandson Gyurme and his family, and you will see how this is all tied to the 2 brothers from the beginning of the story. Craig writes, Gyurme was 25 when he first read the inheritance dispute documents and the earlier agreement between his great-great-great-grandfather and that man's brother. And this is what she writes in her book in page 91. By this time, Gyurme was married with an infant child, but he possessed no birth certificate. This was common for men of his generation born at home, but it posed a challenge if he hoped to procure a Nepali government-issue Nagarita, a citizenship card. This document meant little in the village, but ironically, it was a requirement for leaving the region, for leaving Mustang. For Gyurme to receive such a document, he needed to prove to officials at the district offices that his connection to this corner of Mustang was authentic and that this territory was his birthright. It is at this point that Gyurme stumbles upon this land agreement that was drafted between these 2 brothers a really long time ago, and he also sees this of a settlement that was caused by Yeshi and her claiming the land many years later. So with this agreement, with this document that he found, Gyurme could actually prove that he was linked to this particular land and village, and that his family, or part of his family at least, was from there. So this document then allowed him to get his citizenship card. This was great, not just for Gyurme, but also for his younger brother, Nima. Nima, in fact, had the same problem, the lack of document, that his older brother had. Now, with a land agreement, he could also get a citizenship card. And not only that, he could also get a passport. This was even more important to Nima, because he was actually trying to migrate away from Nepal and to seek work elsewhere. But now let's return to kinship for a moment, to see how and why this is linked to this project of migration. Returning to kinship, the 2 brothers, Gyurme and Nima, were both married to Pema. This form of marriage is a polygamous marriage in which a wife has 2 husbands, usually brothers, and it is called by anthropologists polyandry. Although it is not a very common marriage form, it is a form that is found, for example, in Tibet and Mustang. And that is why Craig writes about it in her book. One of the advantages of polyandry is that it keeps population low, and it keeps land in the family undivided often. So while both Gyurme and Nima were Pema's husband, Gyurme was actually much closer to her than his younger brother, and he was also the biological father of the children of this marriage. And note here that we can think how kinship relations allowed Nima to migrate by proving his identity and helping him to get a citizenship card and a passport. But at the same time, kinship and relations, and particularly the fact that he was less close to his wife Pema than his brother, also motivated him to move away to migrate and work abroad. Because between the two brothers, it actually made more sense for him to leave and to help with remittances than his brother, who was actually the biological father of the children of his household and closer to the wife that they shared. Nima then migrated and worked in Korea for 3 years. He did not mention on the application that he was married because his brother stayed behind to care for their wife, and so he left as if he was single. Nima came back to Nepal after 3 years of working in Korea with some money to help the family. Nima lived with his wife Pema and his brother for 4 years in Nepal before deciding to migrate again, this time from the US. During this time of living in Nepal, however, the older brother Gyurma, became sick. As Craig writes, at this point, Nima's goal to go to America was deepened by family obligations. She writes, he could see the trajectory, medical bills, school fees for his brother's children, and supporting a woman who was, in this culture, his wife, but for whom he had felt at this point little affection. And these again are Craig's words from her chapter. Looking for a way to help with the children upbringing and their family, he left again, this time for New York. And here you see this picture that this drawing that Craig has in her chapter, which I think really nicely encapsulates these movements between New York and working outside of Nepal and families that stays behind and how they are connected. So Craig's story is really interesting and moving, and I really encourage you to read it. At the end of this chapter, and after Gyurna dies while Nima is in New York, Pema and the children join Nima in New York. An interesting thing in this story is how this particular marriage relationship becomes at times visible and at times invisible. While the two brothers are in Nepal, this is a polyandrous relation or marriage in which two brothers are married to one wife. When Gyurna first migrates to Korea, this marriage remains invisible. So to speak, it does not travel across the border. Nima migrates and lives as a single person, and his older brother in Nepal remains for a few years the only spouse to their wife. When the older brother Gyurna dies, however, and Pema goes to live with Nima in New York, Nima's marriage becomes suddenly visible. It comes to the fore. It has, however, become something different. It's no longer a polyandrous relationship, polyandrous marriage, but it has become a union of two spouses, something that is considered the norm in the US. And so it translates in a simple way, so to speak, into a migration into another country. The children of his marriage, most who have Gyurna's biological father and one of his children who has Nima's biological fathers, are simply the children of his marriage. And this is another example of how the idea of blood kinship might not be so significant in all settings. Lastly, the story shows how kinship is not just complicated because of family dispute, the actual lives of people, or particular events, but also because it can be deeply connected to identity, belonging in particular places, land, and migration. Kinship both crosses over borders and connects people through migration, and at the same time, paradoxically, can motivate people to migrate or can be a factor in the migration of people, bringing them far from familiar spaces. At the very end of the story, paradoxically, none of the descendants of the Tashi and Temba brothers end up living on this disputed land, the land that Yeshi had to fight for, even if it was a very agreement, fight, and dispute that allowed them to migrate in the first place.